Hey guys, welcome back to another soft, slow, overly long dive into the parts of history that, honestly, should have made Europe take a long, reflective walk and maybe touch some grass. Tonight, we're easing into our blankets, dimming those harsh little lights, and drifting into the strangely comforting chaos of European royal inbreeding. A topic that somehow manages to be both tragic and a little bit funny, in that I can't believe they actually thought this was a good idea kind of way. Just take a deep breath, let your shoulders drop, and prepare to meet a lineup of kings, queens, dukes, and assorted noble disasters who were all more related than your phone charger collection. We're not rushing, we're gliding, as always. So, let's start our peaceful descent with a family that basically turned inbreeding into a generational hobby. The Habsburgs, because, of course. The Habsburg warm-up, a family that married itself on purpose. If Europe had a poster family for genetic roulette, it would be the Habsburgs. They didn't just dabble in cousin marriages. No, they majored in them. They double-cousined, uncle-nieced, and occasionally did a marriage so tangled the family tree looked like a pretzel left out in the rain. But we're easing into this slowly, calmly, like dipping a toe into a lukewarm genetic pool. Let's wander over to our first soft, sleepy specimen, Charles II of Spain, the final boss of inbreeding. Of course, we're starting with him. It would be illegal not to. Charles II of Spain, also known quietly, politely, as the Bewitched, was born in 1661. And the moment he arrived, the midwives probably looked at him and thought, "Yep, this is what happens when everyone at the family reunion is also on the guest list for the wedding." Charles was basically a living testament to what happens when you use a string tree as your dating app. Product of more than 200 years of intermarriage inside one dynasty, his family tree was about as diverse as a bowl of plain rice. His parents were uncle and niece, his grandparents were also related, and so on, all the way back. His Habsburg jaw, oh yes, that jaw, wasn't just a family trait, it was a long-term collaborative art project. But we're not being mean, we're being soft. We're just acknowledging the historical situation. Charles's childhood, a gentle, slow-motion struggle. Charles didn't develop the way royalty usually hoped their heirs would. He didn't walk until he was 4, didn't talk until he was nearly 7, and honestly, by the time he reached adulthood, he still struggled with tasks his tutors described as basic, which, for a king, is a little awkward. But he tried. We're giving him that. His daily life was slow, very slow, even by the standards of 17th century Spain, which wasn't exactly sprinting into the Enlightenment. His health was a patchwork of chronic issues, digestive problems, immune weaknesses, seizures, infertility. Basically, if you shook a medical textbook and let random pages fall out, Charles had whatever landed on the floor. And yet, he ruled. Not well, but he sat on the throne, wore the crown, and did his best impression of a functioning monarch while his court quietly managed everything behind him like a group project carried by one responsible student. His marriages, romantic? No. Politically stressful? Absolutely. Charles was married twice, once to Marie Louise of Orleans,
who apparently cried upon meeting him, and later to Maria Anna of Neuburg, who arrived ready to produce heirs and was greeted by Charles's whole situation. Neither marriage produced children, not for lack of trying, but for lack of, well, viable genetic infrastructure. The Spanish Empire watched nervously for 35 years.
Charles failed to create an heir, while various European powers circled the monarchy like extremely polite vultures. His death quietly ending an era of genetic determination. Charles died in 1700 at 38 years old, young even by the standards of people who lived through plagues, wars, and questionable 17th century medical advice involving leeches. His autopsy was one for the record books. The doctors reportedly found a heart the size of a peppercorn, a single shriveled testicle, and a body described as full of water, which I'm not a doctor, but I feel like those are all red flags. His death ended the Spanish branch of the Habsburg family, which was probably the nicest thing anyone did for Europe's gene pool during that century. Let's float onward. Let's drift to another royal disaster, Emperor Leopold I. Leopold I, Holy Roman Emperor, was technically Charles's relative many times over, but that's not super helpful as a descriptor because, at this point, so was half of Europe. Leopold was born in 1640 and was a walking endorsement for genetic diversity. His famous Habsburg jaw was particularly dramatic. If the jaw on Charles II looked like a half-baked Habsburg potato, Leopold's looked like someone took the same potato, stretched it out, and decided symmetry was optional. But again, we're gentle, we're calm, we're simply observing history with soft focus. Leopold's early life, you'll be a priest. Actually, never mind. Leopold wasn't supposed to be emperor. His older brother, Ferdinand, was the heir. Leopold was the spare, the kid being groomed for a quiet clerical life. Basically, here, hold this Bible and don't cause trouble. But then Ferdinand died unexpectedly, as royal heirs inconveniently tended to do, and suddenly Leopold was fast-tracked into becoming the most powerful man in Central Europe. He wasn't thrilled.
Accepted it with a kind of resigned, sleep-deprived energy that pairs beautifully with the tone of this video. His personality, bookish, mild, and allergic to fun. While other monarchs enjoyed hunting, parties, or accidentally starting wars, Leopold preferred music, religion, collecting things, and writing poetry that absolutely no one asked for. He was basically the 17th century version of an introverted Tumblr user. His marriages, more family loops. Leopold married 3 times. His brides were all technically related to him in various ways, because at this point, Europe was a small social circle, and the Habsburgs didn't believe in outbreeding. With his first 2 wives, he had no surviving children. His third wife, Eleanor Magdalene, who was also his cousin, finally produced heirs, including the future emperor Joseph I, who inherited the jaw and the long Habsburg tradition of marrying relatives as though it were a tax requirement. Leopold's legacy: more wars than kids, but still plenty of both. Leopold ruled for nearly 50 years. During that time, he fought the Ottomans, dealt with French invasions, survived plague outbreaks, and kept the Habsburg marriage strategy alive and well. You know, the strategy of, what if we didn't marry outside the family for another 200 years? Let's drift onward again, slowly, like a poorly constructed Habsburg carriage rolling down a hill. Floating over to Princess Joanna of Austria. The quiet tragedy. Joanna of Austria is not as famous as Charles II or Leopold I, but she should be. She was born in 1535, at a time when the Habsburg family still pretended their marriage choices were fine. Joanna was, well, let's call her deeply Habsburg in appearance. The jaw, the chin, the whole package delivered by centuries of cousin-based genetics. But her story is quietly sad in a way that fits our slow, soft drift through history. Her personality, pious, withdrawn, and gentle. Joanna was said to be extremely religious, which in the 16th century meant she was basically the default setting. She spent her youth in convent-like environments, surrounded by prayers, rituals, and the subtle realization that everyone she knew was also her cousin. Her marriage, a political trade-off. She was married off to Francesco I de' Medici of Florence, who did not like her at all, not even a little bit. In fact, he openly preferred his mistress, Bianca Capello, who existed at the Florentine court like an unofficial queen. Joanna knew this. She accepted it. Her life was a quiet exercise in patience. Her children, a future queen amid the sadness. Despite the loneliness, Joanna had several children. Most died young because the 1500s were not known for robust public health. But one daughter survived to adulthood, Maria of Austria, who later became Queen of France. Joanna herself died at age 30 after falling on the stairs while pregnant. Rumors swirled, of course they did, that maybe her husband helped the fall along. There was never proof, only the soft echo of court whispering. Her story is small, subtle, but it's one of those gentle reminders that royal inbreeding wasn't just funny. It was often quietly tragic. And with that, we drift onward again. All right. Take a breath. Let your shoulders melt like overcooked medieval porridge. Because in part 1, we got acquainted with Charles II, Leopold I, and gentle Joanna. Now we're gliding further through the royal gene pool, which by this point is less a pool and more a decorative fountain with questionable water quality. Tonight, we're drifting toward the quieter tragedies, the subtle disasters, the princes and princesses who really didn't ask to be born into a family tree shaped like maybe a strip. Let's float over to our next royal tangle. The tragic Habsburg sisters, Margarita Teresa and Maria Teresa. Same family, different destinies. Let's start with two sisters who grew up surrounded by portraits of ancestors that all looked suspiciously similar to each other, as one does in the Habsburg dynasty. These two women lived in the same golden, incense-filled court in Vienna, were raised by the same parents, and shared about 150% of the same DNA, give or take. And yet, their lives turned out very differently. We'll start with the more famous one. Margarita Teresa, the girl from the painting who never got to grow up. Do you know the painting Las Meninas by Velázquez? The one with the tiny blonde girl in the fancy silver dress, surrounded by attendants. That's Margarita Teresa, one of the most painted children in European history. Because apparently, when your family has spent centuries marrying cousins, the moment someone is born without an alarming jawline, everyone grabs a paintbrush. But her real life was less glamorous than the canvas. A childhood of paintings, protocols, and people whispering about her bloodline. Margarita Teresa was born in 1551 and was considered the jewel of the Habsburg dynasty, partly because she was adorable, and partly because she represented something the family desperately needed, a fresh-ish genetic branch. She spent her childhood being posed for portraits, learning royal manners, and existing as a political asset. Very peaceful, very structured, very Europe's most valuable chess piece. Her marriage? Guess who? Her uncle. Of course. At age 15, she was shipped off to Spain to marry her uncle, King Philip IV. Because why bring new DNA into the dynasty when you can recycle the old kind like it's a medieval compost heap? Philip was 30 years older and had already been married to Margarita's aunt, Royal love triangles really did hit different in the 1600s. The marriage was supposed to keep the Habsburg Empire tied together genetically, politically, and in whatever dimension family trees exist at this point. Motherhood and decline. Too many births, too little health. Margarita Theresa had several pregnancies in rapid succession because royal women were expected to pop out heirs like slightly frightened decorative birds. But her health deteriorated quickly. She died at age 21, exhausted, ill, worn down by the same dynasty that had painted her smiling onto canvases. Her only surviving child became the father of, guess who? Charles II of Spain, our Part 1 genetic end boss. It's all connected. Of course it is. It's the Habsburgs. Maria Theresa, the survivor who wasn't supposed to thrive. Margarita's sister, Maria Theresa, was born with the same Habsburg jawline and the same dense genetic overlap, but she somehow lived longer, long enough to become Holy Roman Empress and have 16 children. Because if your DNA is shaped like a pretzel, at least spread it generously. Maria Theresa is usually remembered as powerful, intelligent, and somewhat stubborn, all qualities that pair well with running half of Europe from a velvet-trimmed palace. But her personal life was still a tapestry woven with quiet grief, lost children, and the pressure to maintain a dynasty that was on the brink of biological collapse. Her marriage was a surprisingly tender partnership. Maria Theresa married Francis Stephen of Lorraine, who, miracle of miracles, was not her cousin. Well, okay, he was related to her somewhere far back, but compared to her immediate family, he might as well have been from another planet. Their marriage was affectionate, which was rare for royal unions and extremely shocking for a Habsburg one. 16 children, a soft, endless cycle of joy and loss. She had 16 children. That's one short of a full royal battalion. But several died young. One was mentally disabled. One struggled with seizures. And of course, one was Marie Antoinette, beloved icon, future queen, and professional symbol of aristocratic excess. Maria Theresa spent her life pregnant, ruling, worrying, mourning, and writing letters about her children's marriages like a 1700s version of a mom with an overly active WhatsApp group. Let's drift onward, gently, toward another familial disaster. Next up, the Bourbons, the family that didn't know when to stop marrying itself. If the Habsburgs were the kings of inbreeding, the Bourbons were the enthusiastic understudies who kept trying to prove they could be just as genetically questionable. Let's softly glide over to France, where powdered wigs, velvet curtains, and mild genetic chaos were the aesthetic. Louis XIV's children, official and unofficial, and very related. Louis XIV, the Sun King, the man who basically invented French royal drama, had a family tree that looked less like a tree and more like a decorative nut. He had legitimate children with Queen Maria Theresa, acknowledged illegitimate children with his mistresses, unacknowledged illegitimate children, quite a list, and multiple children who married their cousins, half-cousins, second cousins, and so on. But we're not judging. We're sleepily observing. Maria Theresa, the poor wife who deserved a vacation. Louis XIV's wife, Maria Theresa of Spain, was a full-blooded Habsburg, which meant she brought the famous jawline to France like a genetic souvenir. She was sweet, gentle, quiet, and deeply ignored. Louis was too busy conquering Europe, building Versailles, and flirting with every woman within a 5-mile radius. Their only surviving legitimate child, a soft, sickly boy. Their son, Louis, the Grand Dauphin, inherited the usual mix of Habsburg traits: poor health, length in chin, high forehead, and a melancholy disposition. He was like a living pastry brush with a seed of sadness stored inside. Health, weak constitution, tendency toward passive decision-making, and a face that said, "Yes, my parents were technically cousins, and no, I don't want to talk about it." He died before becoming king, which saved France from having two Louis XVI in a row. Let's drift over to a different Bourbon branch now, a quieter one. Let's glide to Spain again, the Bourbon princes who were cousins 5 different ways after the Habsburgs finally ran out of genetic viability. The Bourbons took over Spain and immediately started marrying their cousins again, because traditions matter. One of the more quietly tragic results was Louis I of Spain, who became king at 17 and died at 17, which is arguably the shortest and saddest job tenure in the history of monarchy. Louis I, a fragile king in a fragile dynasty. Louis I had asthma, fevers, digestive problems, and a nervous disposition that made him look like he was permanently worried about something, which, to be fair, was an appropriate mood for a dynasty held together by wishful thinking. His marriage was unconsummated for months because he was too ill, and also because he married his cousin, which probably did not help the comfort level. He died of smallpox, and Spain sighed, shrugged, and went back to the family marriage chart like, okay, who's next? Let's drift again, lightly, gently. A soft detour to the Wittelsbachs, the family that collected tragedy like it was a hobby. The Wittelsbach dynasty of Bavaria wasn't as aggressively inbred as the Habsburgs or Bourbons, but they had enough cousin unions to create their own quiet disasters. Let's wander over to one of their most tragic heirs, Crown Prince Ludwig of Bavaria, a gentle soul in a family of cousins. Ludwig was born in the 19th century, time when Europe was starting to realize that marrying your first cousin maybe wasn't the best long-term plan. The Wittelsbachs took this information under advisement and then continued marrying cousins anyway. Ludwig was frail, sensitive, and artistic, qualities that did not thrive under the pressure of being groomed to rule Bavaria. He struggled with mental health issues that today would be treatable, but back then were simply labeled as melancholic or overly sensitive, which is medieval for, we have no idea what's happening, so let's pray about it. He died young, quietly, the way so many in his lineage did. Let's float onward gently to a quieter kingdom. Another royal loop, the Braganzas of Portugal. Ah, yes, Portugal. The seafaring empire that explored the world, but apparently refused to explore new marriage options. Our softly spotlighted figure here is Maria I of Portugal. Maria I, the queen who inherited too many problems. Maria I inherited the Portuguese throne in 1777 and immediately began showing signs of severe mental distress. She had panic attacks, night terrors, depressive spirals, and episodes described as profound religious despair. Modern historians suspect a combination of untreated mental illness, the stress of royal life, hereditary factors caused by generations of cousin marriage. Again, a quiet tragedy shaped by a dynasty that refused to diversify. She spent the final decades of her life in Brazil, softly, slowly, quietly, losing her grip on reality. It's sad, but peaceful, and very on brand for our bedtime journey.